Okay, so moving on to part 2. All right. So continuing on with the Sumerian period, the primary building material was mud brick. All right. So how well do you think mud brick holds up to something like floods? No bueno. No. All right. So structurally, another aspect of mud brick is that it's weak. These weren't hardened bricks. These were bricks that were made by taking dirt, right, and putting them in a mold and letting it dry. They were just basically clods of dirt formed into blocks or bricks, okay? So it was weak, and one of the ways that they compensated for that was by building really thick walls. You couldn't build a thin wall and put a lot of weight on top of it because it would just crush. So you had to build a thicker and thicker and thicker wall in order to take the loads that you had to put on top of it, okay? The thick walls also worked as a thermal insulator. So the regions that we're talking about are relatively hot regions. Okay? So, any of you guys ever been down into a cave?
Yes.
So if you've been down into a cave, you know the caves are kind of cooler than the outdoor environment, particularly if you're out in the Arizona desert. I should show pictures of last year when we went to, we took the club took the trip down to Antelope Canyon. And you go down and you go up on top and it's kind of warm. You go down below and it's cooler.
Are we going this year?
I don't know. Maybe. Depends on whether the club survives or not. Hey, back to this thing. So the thermal insulation capacity was another one of the things that the mud bricks kind of helped to do. One other thing is that mud bricks did not span very far distances. Right? And so most of the openings and the spaces were narrow. Okay? Like this room is very broad and there's nothing in the middle of it, right? Those spaces weren't like that. The brick would only span certain amount of distances, and so they couldn't really have big openings. Okay? All right. So some of the problems with this type of construction obviously included that it deteriorated in the weather and in water, right? Mud just turns back into mud. Mud bricks turn back into mud. So the other thing is it's kind of ugly, right? It's freaking mud. It's lower than dirt. So they solved this problem by a couple of things. One, they created, I guess it's a sort of a form of paint that they would whitewash the structures with, right, which would kind of protect them from the water that fell on them. And the other thing was that they developed this system of creating these pigmented cones that were made out of either stone or out of clay. And I'm pretty sure that the clay was some way hardened, right, so that it was harder than the brick. And they would just pound these things into the walls. And so here you have a picture of Mesopotamian cone mosaic. On the one side, you see the cones themselves. On the other side, you see, a piece of a wall with the cones pushed into it. All right? So think of them as kind of like colorful nails, right? Big, colorful nails that you pounded in. Remember I mentioned to you guys that weaving and fabric making was an important aspect of their culture? Take a look at that. Right? And so now you start to see, these are the cones, right, pushed into a wall, and you see the patterns that are being created are very much like fabric patterns. Okay? So culturally, that was an important thing. Here's another example of the same thing, this one in color. You can start to see a lot of the tones are earth tones, but you can see the pattern in it compared to just regular old mud. Right? Okay, so how far? What? Huh?
No, I said I'm gonna ask something. Like their name.
Hold on. I can't let this go. Hold on to it. Okay, hold on to it because I can't stop this thing. You guys are timing this, right? Yeah. Okay, so we talked about the fact that these rivers in this region was subject to flooding, right? Yeah, I didn't put the graphic in here, but one of the things that's really interesting about the region is that the rivers were actually above the plains that were around them. They had natural levees. In other words, they had these natural banks And when the river flooded, it would overflow the banks and it would just literally flood the flatlands around the areas. And so one of the things that they started to kind of realize is that, hey, if we build something out of mud, it's not going to last through these floods. So they started to build these big, giant mountains of dirt, of mud brick. Okay, and they literally thought of them as mountains. The symbolic function of these mountains were called ziggurats, and the symbolic function was similar to the Egyptian pyramid, to bridge between the earthly and the divine, right? In the pyramids, they were thought of more as a stair to the heavens or to the godly realm. Here it was just getting you up closer. So that was one of the functions of those things. The other thing about them is that these mountains were big. You know, there were many stories high, and so those were the seats of power. These guys functioned on what's called a theocracy. It is human beings connected to a god, right? And they kind of tell the other humans what the rules are. Okay, so at any rate, so it becomes kind of important to understand that you know, this whole stratification of culture, right? In the mind of those people was that the ruling class was tied to what God was telling them to do, or a God was telling them to do. So one of the first cities that we're going to look at, and notice that I am pointing at it with an arrow. This is the same image that I showed you earlier. Okay, is Uruk, right? So anybody know how many minutes we're at?
2 minutes.
Okay, so one of the buildings we're going to look at is called the White Temple at Uruk. All right, and this is the remains of the White Temple at Uruk. So this is a man-made mound. Okay, so that is a big-ass mound of dirt. That is not just a dirt pile. That is a monstrous pile of mud brick. So it dates back to about 3,000 before the Common Era. And this was the prototype structure. This was the first one that would become the pattern for future ziggurats. Okay? Down here you see a map of the ziggurat itself, and you see a map of the temple. Notice how small the rooms are compared to the thickness of the walls. Compare that to what you might imagine this room looks like, right? The walls are super thin, and there's a lot of space in the middle, right? If you look at that one, it's like, well, gosh, those rooms are pretty small, and the walls are really, really thick, okay? So then you have this statue, and the interesting thing about the statue, I couldn't find an image that was up close, but on this statue, there is a floor plan of a temple, right? On the person's on the person's lap.
Is that made out of mud too?
I think that's stone. I believe that is stone. So, in this modern age that we're in, we kind of take for granted a lot of the stuff we see on TV. But one of the things that is kind of interesting is the fact that we could digitally model and create these images, right, of what it was like. And a large part of this is taken from 3 different ways of looking at stuff. One is what you actually find on site. And that part, I'm just telling you this, it's not written in there. So part of it is like, okay, we know there's a mound, right, and there might even be foundations of the building left. Second thing is what can be deduced from written or graphic records, or things that can be deduced from other buildings of the same period. And the third level is basically guesswork. It's conjecture, okay, based on what we knew of the culture, civilizations, and technology. But this becomes a recreation of that. You can see that the interiors of these spaces were very dimly lit. You couldn't have these very large openings, right? One of the things to understand about Samaria is they didn't have wood. Any wood that they used had to come from long distances. Okay, and so you start to get an idea that these spaces were were somewhat confined and that there was very little sunlight penetrating into them. Okay? Here you see kind of an exterior view of what it might have looked like. So this was all Uruk, not Ur. We're going to move on to Ur in just a moment. How many minutes am I at?
You got 5 minutes.
You sure?
Because you started before we started.
Are you counting down or are you counting up?
Exactly.
Okay, so now let's move on to a different city. You can see that Uruk is further up the river, and downriver, closer to the Persian Gulf, is the city of Ur. Okay? And Ur is where we find a more refined version of the ziggurat. Okay? So this is the ziggurat of Ur. It is a modern day reconstruction, so pieces of it have been reconstructed. You can actually visit this place. These are actual images of it. The temple is obviously not there, right? But you can see the ziggurat. You can see this man-made mountain that the city would have been built around. Okay? The temple would have been up on top of it. Here's a floor plan of the temple. It was done by a French archaeologist, right? I discovered this in the 1800s. And you get an idea that this one, compared to the first one we saw, was pretty refined. It has 3 staircases going up. It has multiple tiered levels. Here's a 3-dimensional view of it. Particularly of note here, just take a note of the scale. This is a human being. So this is a very large structure. Okay? Here it's being shown with the temple at the top and the various stages coming up and the sort of entrance gateway that leads you into the deeper areas. Entrance gateway being this thing right here. Okay, you can see the 3 staircases kind of leading up to it. Okay, any questions about that? No? All right, I'm going to go on, push on into the Assyrian period. Okay, the next people who fought a war with the Sumerian Babylonians and won were the Assyrians. Okay? And so they basically absorbed the culture, but their culture predominated. They took the math, the science, they took all of the parts of Sumeria that they could and absorbed it into their culture, but their culture was the predominant flow of things at that time, or the predominant influence. These people were warriors and hunters. Right? They were not farmers. Okay? And one of the things that led them to be such a huge force in conquering major parts of the known world was that they developed chariots and horse-drawn chariots. And so they had like soldiers on horse and in chariots. All right? Now that's an important distinction because somebody in a chariot can move a hell of a lot faster than someone on foot, right? And when you're in a chariot, you've got some level of protection, and you have a place where you can keep weapons and stuff. And so that became kind of an important sort of way of conquering people that didn't have that technology. All right? So there were 2 primary capital, Khorsabad, which was where the citadel of King Sargon II was located, and the biblical city of Nineveh. Okay? This is the French archaeologist Paul-Émile Botta. He discovered it in the late 1800s. He thought he had discovered Nineveh, right? The biblical Nineveh. But the reality was what he had found was Khorsabad. And when he discovered this, he was French, obviously, so a lot of panels were removed and taken to the Louvre in Paris, which is another place that you guys can eventually visit. Okay? Yep. 15. All right. I'm gonna try and blast through this period. So you can see now that in the lower part where Babylon was, which was down in here, right? There's Uruk and Ur. Right, that the Assyrians moved up into the highlands, they moved up into Turkey, and they actually conquered Egypt at one point.
So all of the red is Assyria.
That was Assyria, which is the second period of Mesopotamia. All right. Here we see some images of like the excavation from the 1800s, or the late 1800s, or late to mid 1800s. And you can see, people kind of pulling out these large stone portions of buildings and portions of statuettes and statue, right? This stuff was stone. Unlike further down in Babylonia, there was access to stone further to the north. Okay. Examples of the architecture. This is the King Sargon's palace, King Sargon II. One of the things about the Assyrians were that they weren't as refined as the Babylonians. They were warriors, man. These guys, they fought wars. They hunted. They were like manly men. And so, like manly men, they were pigs. No, just kidding. They were not as thorough. So when you look at stuff, you'll start to notice that the buildings aren't that neatly laid out, right? I think I have another image where you can see a true sort of modern day plan of what it was
I
like.
think it's massive, right?
It is massive, but you look at the mess that we have here. Look at, we'll just kind of throw this thing up. Oh, it's a little bit off. Never mind, just keep building. Right? Sounds like some of the contractors I deal with. Oh, ooh. All right, let me keep going. Some drawings of the excavation dating back to 1849. A picture of a guy. This was when the University of Chicago eventually started the excavation there in the 1900s, early 1900s. All right. Some of the stuff that's in the Louvre, which is the Assyrian war chariots, and two of the winged bulls with people's heads on them. There's a name for these guys, and I can't quite remember what it was. Right, these two were at what was referred to as the Khorsabad Gate, and in the Louvre, there's a recreation of it.
It's recreation. It's not that.
No, these are the actual ones. They were taken from Mesopotamia and taken to Europe. So that's the actual ones. But the gate itself, what you see here, right up above it, is a recreation. So here's a side view of the same thing. So you start to get an idea that it's a bull with a man's head and wings. Okay. Yes, sir.
So you're saying at that point they had archways?
They did have archways at that point. Yep. Okay, so we are almost out of time, and this video is getting too long, so I am going to stop it here, and we will pick up here next class.